Okay, are we live?
Looks like it.
Hold on one second. We are live.
Okay. So welcome to our Tikkun Leil Shavuot this year at Beth Yeshurun. Our program this evening, as you hopefully know, is going to be about the film Children of the Inquisition. I hope that many of you were able to see the film beforehand, but if for some reason you weren't able to see it yet, you can still go back to our website and register and watch it until Sunday evening at 8 p.m. And hopefully, if you haven't seen it, you'll be more interested in seeing it after this conversation this evening. We want to thank the Bennett and Robin Greenspan Charitable Foundation for underwriting the presentation of this film for our program tonight. And I want to welcome Joseph Lovett, who
Hello.
produced this informative and thought-provoking film. And I also want to welcome Doreen Carvajal, who is one of the people featured in the film. She is a Paris-based reporter for the New York Times, and she's joining us from France. So we want to thank her very much for staying up till 3:30 in the morning in Paris, so that she could be with us this evening. And finally, I want to welcome Anna Guerra, our own Anna Guerra, who spoke last Yom Kippur about her experience of discovering her own Jewish ancestry and has done extensive research on the conversos and crypto Jews in the Texas, Mexico area. So Anna and I are going to kind of guide this part of the conversation, but you're welcome to ask questions if you'd like at the chat box on the website, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those questions. If you saw the movie, you probably it raises questions about Jewish identity and how much Ashkenazic Jews know about Sephardic Jews and the important history of Sephardic Jews, and particularly about the tragic expulsion and forced conversion of those Jews, which is also an important part of the Jewish story. Since most Jews in America are Ashkenazic Jews, we may not have been so familiar with this story. So the first question, just to open things up, I want to ask Joe Lovett. You're a documentary film producer.
Right.
What made you want to do this particular topic?
Well, I've been a filmmaker all my life. I used to work at CBS News. I was at ABC News. Excuse me, I should have talked more. I was a producer at ABC News at 2020 for 10 years. And I opened up my own company after 10 years at 2020. We produced about 35 hours of network programming, primetime programming, plus 7 documentary feature films. So this is a topic that has been with me since I was 13 years old, as I say in the film. Our rabbi had been, when I was 13, and he should have been bar mitzvahing me, he was on sabbatical doing research or trying to do research on the descendants of the people that were then called Marranos, the families that had converted to Catholicism to save their lives in the 1400s, for the most part, in 1500s, 1300s and 1400s. And excuse me, and he couldn't get anybody to speak to him. He came back and he gave this brilliant sermon that I remember to this day. I was 13, called Todos Católicos, Everybody's Catholic. And he said how the shadow of the Inquisition loomed so dark over contemporary Spain at the time that nobody dared even consider that they had a drop of Jewish blood. And to a 13-year-old, 500 years is a really long time. And I thought, how could something that happened so long ago still possibly resonate and have an effect on people? And it just sort of stayed with me. And then years later, after my sister died, her husband, who I was very close to, they had raised me actually, married a Sephardic woman, a friend of my sister's. And she and her mother used to regale me with stories of the diaspora and from their family's experience. And they could trace themselves quite far back, I think all the way to Barcelona. And so it became more alive for me. And it was such a huge topic. I mean, the first proposal for this film was written 20 years ago. And we didn't start shooting till 10 years ago. And, it's sort of an overwhelming task because it's such a, I mean, the film makes it seem pretty straightforward, but it's a very difficult topic to get to understand.
And you went to several countries to film it.
oh my God, so many hundreds of years, so many countries, so many oceans, so many changes of name, changes of religion, and within the same families. And so, you know, you can be looking at one person, let alone one family, and they could have 3 or 4 different names depending upon where they were living and which identity they had taken. It's fascinating. And what's also fascinating is that they went from Jew to Catholic, often back to Jew again, in different areas. And I guess also another reason I was interested is that I grew up in New England, in Providence, Rhode Island, and I went to sort of a WASPy school, and I always felt that Jews were outsiders, that they weren't part of the mainstream. And in studying this, I realized that Jews had always been very much part of the mainstream, and that I had really been sort of misled by my schoolmates. But you know, as Jane Gerber says in the film, 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish, and 10% of Hispania, of Iberia, was Jewish as well. So they had a huge influence. And as David Gitlitz points out in the film, the male Jews were almost 100% literate in a society where people didn't read and write. So it gave them a leg up and an opportunity. You know, we always hear about Jews being administrators and tax collectors and money lenders. Well, one of the reasons they were able to work in administrative positions was that they could read and write and add, multiply, and divide.
So, Doreen, I also want to ask you, I guess, so you discovered your Jewish roots. How did that come about, and how did that affect your life?
She muted?
Oh, Doreen, did your computer?
Well,
there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. When you set out on a path like this, it's a journey with lots of twists and turns, and you don't know where you're going, and you don't realize where you've gone till you look back. And in my case, it shifted my identity to the core. I had grown up Catholic, 5 siblings, went to church every Sunday. I think there's a reference to that in the movie. Very Catholic, and it was only that there were hints along the way because of my byline and an unusual name in the United States, Carvajal. Occasionally people would make comments about my name. One time I was covering a synagogue in Philadelphia when I worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the rabbi said, you know, your last name is Sephardic and from the Iberian Peninsula. And I did not know what Sephardic meant. I mean, I had no idea. It didn't fit in the context of my life. I only got interested in this later in middle age when I moved to genealogy. And that's when I started asking questions and of relatives, some who had already died. So I lost some valuable knowledge along the way. I started seeing clues that there were things in my family that weren't what they seemed. My father had come from Costa Rica. I think that was in the movie too. There were things that my family did, like my great aunt who used to keep a menorah in her cupboard and pray to it. I didn't know that at the time. And a menorah in her cupboard. My cousin later told me about it, and I lived in her apartment when I took Spanish courses in Costa Rica, but I didn't know. It was so out of context. The women tended to be the keepers of the secrets to pass on information about Jewish origins and some of the practices and customs that they continued to maintain. So how it affected me is that it shifted my identity. By that time, I was very secular, even though I was raised Catholic, and it set me on a path of looking at my own spirituality in light of Jewish beliefs and faith. And it changed how I viewed who I am. And the wonderful thing about, for anyone, of going back and looking at their history of their ancestors is it made me realize the triumphs and failures that they had. And it's kind of like I had the difficulties. I could always think back to them and what they went through. And that my difficulties were never compared to what they went through. I mean, one ancestor that is made reference to in the museum, the Diego Arias Davila, his family was investigated, spied on by the Inquisition, political fights with Torquemada. The family spread to other countries and still managed to flourish. So I find their stories very inspiring for me, and they gave me comfort in my difficult times.
Had you been back to Spain to see the places where your ancestors lived and so on until the film was made? I mean, had you visited there before?
I had been to Segovia before when I was doing the research on my family, and in any search, I got lucky. Someone referred me to a teacher who was doing her dissertation on my ancestors, page dissertation, which gave me lots of information, took me on a walking tour. I really got lucky because that was not something that I could have found otherwise. She told me about a book that was published in the 1980s by another professor that was basically transcripts of the Inquisition investigation of my ancestors who were investigated for heresy, for basically secretly practicing Judaism. And that led me with Joe for the movie to, so everything was a little step along the way, and it took some time. And when I began, I didn't know any of that. And I looked at many different lines of my family in Costa Rica, on my grandmother's side, on my grandfather's side, to get a view of patterns and clues, because no one had the full picture. Went to Costa Rica as well, and clues along the way, like the menorah in the cupboard, or my grandfather didn't go to my father's first communion, that my great-grandfather would go walking. One of them was a rabbi, and yet outwardly they were Catholic, but there were clues along the way that something was happening. And that's the great thing about genealogical research. It's not just death, marriage, birth, but trying to find those stories, trying to find the patterns. Another pattern was endogamy, cousins marrying cousins in Costa Rica. And when I was doing the research, I came across relatives who'd gotten special dispensations from the Catholic Church for cousins to be married. And the reason behind that is that cousins could trust each other with this secret. It kept the descendants together without fear that they would be persecuted, because they're basically marrying family.
Right. And I think there's another point here to this, the cousins marrying cousins. When the Jews converted to Christianity, they became called New Christians or conversos. But many of them, especially in Portugal, there was a forced conversion in 1497, but they were allowed to continue to practice Judaism privately as long as they showed up publicly in church on Sundays, which is really fascinating. And so for them, so since they were able to maintain these Jewish rites, and Judaism became very much a practice at the home rather than in public. So when the families married, they married people who came from the same lines, and they had the same traditions. Like Carlos de Medeiros, one of our other storytellers, he's from Brazil, and he comes from a very devout Catholic family. In fact, he had been a seminarian, and a cousin had started doing genealogy, and we went to Brazil and started following some of this stuff out. And they had continued from 1497, the family had been marrying other conversos. And so they all, to this day, all the boys are circumcised in the family. They don't eat shellfish. They don't mix milk and meat, but they have no idea what it means. So the rites and the habits, the rites became habits and or customs, but they lost their meaning.
Wow.
So it's the most fascinating subject.
Right. So Doreen, you also there was
and what's really interesting too is, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to add, the other thing that really fascinates me is that it's the women over generations that really preserve the rituals and customs and pass them along, in part probably because they were in the home, it was more private, they weren't out in public, and typically the women would pass on information to particular people in the family that they felt they could trust, that other people wouldn't reveal what was going on in the family. And I just find it fascinating that the women help preserve this identity over generations.
There's a lot of stories among conversos about the women lighting candles on Friday evening, obviously Shabbat candles, but not even remembering what it was about, but they would continue, and it would always be in a hidden room somewhere so nobody outside could see. But Doreen, you said you didn't have any of those stories, or you weren't able to ask any of the women because they...
I didn't, well, that's true, that the great aunt who would have known had died by the time I figured out that something was going on. And it was only through my cousin, my younger cousin, who was her grandson and lived in the home with her, that I found out about the menorah. And only, I didn't find out about people lighting the candles, but, I found out about other things like the family meals being on Saturday rather than on Sunday, which would have been more traditional for either going off to meet with a group of men on Saturday morning. One of them, a rabbi, I think it was the Finkelstein family. They were Ashkenazi, and they owned a pharmacy chain. So little clues like that.
Interesting.
I have another friend, Jeannie Milgram. Maybe you've heard about her as well. She's written a book about the recipes of her grandmothers. And I find the recipes really interesting because they also are clues to hidden history. She has a recipe for breaded tomato and pepper veg in the shape of a pork chop. And
in
so,
the shape of a pork chop.
her view is that was another way. It was in the shape, the bread was shaped like a pork chop with tomato sauce on top and peppers.
You can pretend like you're having pork and not really have it.
Right.
Right. Exactly. And, obviously that was really...
You mentioned also this hot stew that, of course, Jews all over the world, whatever culture they're in, for Saturday would always have some hot stew because you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. So you'd set it up before Shabbat came in. And in different Jewish cultures, it's called something different. Cholent is what it's usually called in Ashkenazic world. But you said you had seen that also in your family, right?
Well, in my ancestor line, it's the stew was called adafina, cooked on slow coals overnight. A stew of spices, even putting. Well, it's in the movie too, I think.
Yes.
We even they even put hard-boiled eggs and
Right.
cook them in the
It's a
stew,
typical Sephardic thing.
still in a shell. Right, and when I was looking at the Inquisition documents, I mean, it was really revealing and telling because adafina came up over and over. You know, neighbors testifying to inquisitors that they had seen my ancestor, the Davila family, eating adafina, had maids who would deliver adafina. It was a constant sign to them, to the inquisitors, that something was going on, that they were still secretly preserving their Jewish faith.
So there's also a very dramatic scene in the film that left a big impression on me, where you see your ancestor's tomb, right? And it's this slab with their images carved in stone, I guess, right? And it's in a church, not a.
I mean, that was an incredible moment. These were the almost life-size sculptures of three of my ancestors. One, my great-grandfather, 16 times removed, a former financial advisor. They had those grave sculptures. They were in a little, oddly, in a backyard chapel of a house that belonged to the Marquesa de Lozoya. And that's a mansion from the 13th to 15th century. So try to imagine that in Segovia, how these sculptures ended up in a little private backyard chapel. And the house, this mansion, is actually across the street from the Casa de Cadenas, the House of Chains, where the Inquisition investigators were housed. They were investigating my relatives and their descendants back then. Through a producer for Joe, she was able to persuade the Marquesa to open up the backyard chapel. Apparently in the 19th, acquire the sculptures. They were tearing down a building where the sculptures had been housed before. But it was amazing to touch the hands of the sculptures.
Right? It's their life-size image.
And to imagine what they were like. And I found a fourth gravestone in a Madrid museum for my great grandmother, 16 times removed, Elvira Gonzalez. And that meant a lot to me because her original name was Clara. And, you know, when her family converted, she changed her name to Elvira. But it meant a lot to me because my daughter's name is Claire. And I felt like which is the French version. And I felt like that somehow I had connected to her and that even my daughter bore her name.
Yeah, you know, we had some very exciting times in Segovia. I mean, we gained access to the National Archives in Madrid, and Doreen and I and David Gitlitz, who is our expert, who's actually knows a great deal about Doreen's family. We went in and they brought up the Inquisition records with the depositions against her family. And these are ancient documents, and David read them for us. So we're there with these handwritten, by scribes, these documents, and you could see they would write for so many pages, then a new hand would come in. And they described in detail what was going on with Doreen's 16th great grandfather, Diego. And it was in detail about that somebody had arrived from the Jewish quarter with adafina, and they retired to the upstairs room to eat it. Details about the death of Elvira and how somebody this witness talked about how she she had created a pillow of virgin earth so that they could put it behind her head in deference to the Jewish custom of being buried in virgin earth rather than in a used catacomb as Christians were. It was the greatest privilege, and what happened was that it felt like centuries just collapsed.
Right.
And these people that were Doreen's relatives and their friends and neighbors, it was like we knew them, and there was before medieval history used to seemed so far away, and this felt like we could reach back and touch them. I mean, it was extraordinary.
Right. The books were like, thick, and it was was it parchment pages or paper, whatever, however it lasted for hundreds of years.
Yeah, like the legatos, and it was just amazing, leather bound, beautiful. They were just beautiful. And
what I think is very interesting about those procesos is that they are very detailed about
exquisite.
it's exquisite detail, and minute by minute they document what's being said and what the prisoner is responding, and you get a clue as to what these people were suffering. And the charges seem so trivial sometimes.
Yes.
We talked about, cooking this. Sometimes it was, you got accused of changing the linens on Friday, for example, or bathing on Friday. It's remarkable the things that you were being accused of.
Yeah, cleanliness was very suspect, which is rather interesting in these days of COVID. Cleanliness was very, very suspect. And, it's utterly fascinating, utterly fascinating. And, another thing that I thought was interesting, and Anna, maybe you could speak to
There was one.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say there was one other scene in those transcripts that was so vivid and colorful, and it was testimony against Diego Arias Davila, also on his deathbed. Those are often pivotal moments for conversos or converts, because their true identity would come out. And there were some priests who came to his bedside to give him the last rites. And I'm forgetting the exact words in the transcripts, but he basically said something like, "Get the hell out of here."
Go to the devil.
And ousted the visiting priest. And that was another clue to the inquisitors that his real identity was as a Jew. There are many stories. Yeah, there are many stories of, down the line over generations of a grandfather or a grandmother, a great-grandmother, in their dying days, revealing to their family generations who they really were and what their real faith was. So for the Inquisitor, it was a critical moment.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've noticed, and Anna, maybe you could speak to this, among the people that I spoke to doing the research, Jeannie Milgram, who Doreen mentioned, is one of them. They spoke about how they grew up in Catholic families, but they, among all their brothers and sisters, one person didn't feel comfortable as a Catholic and had never felt comfortable. And Jeannie, as a matter of fact, she comes from a Cuban family, Cuban-American family. And she converted as a teenager. She became interested as a teenager, married in the Catholic Church, and then converted later and ended her marriage. But she had always felt this tie to Judaism. And then when she started to think, well, maybe I wonder if there's something to this, and she started to research it, she discovered that she was matrilinearly Jewish all the way back to 15 grandmothers.
Wow.
And if I know her history a little bit because I've heard it, she actually converted and she's Orthodox, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
She converted even before she found out about her history.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's actually something that happens in the converso, when you have the converso background. There are people who have this sense that they want to be Jewish, and oftentimes they don't know why.
Yeah.
And then they're attracted to, and they convert, and then it's only later that they discover what their history.
Right. I mean, when we start to research the film, I started to think, oh yeah. I mean, that's very cute, you know. But I'm a journalist, and I didn't take it all too seriously. However, after you hear these stories over and over and over again, and you're become more aware of the studies that have been done since the Holocaust on intergenerational trauma and the imprinting of effects, you know, good and bad, you start to wonder, well, just how much does really come through in genetic imprinting? I mean, I don't know, but I think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things, Joe, your movie does is it shows obviously when the expulsion happened, the Jews were, and you over and over again, you have this graphic of the red lines from Spain going out to the New World and up into
everywhere.
Europe.
Yeah,
they're all being transmitted all over the world, and
all over the world.
you also went to El Paso, where Rabbi Leon is, and
Right.
he's been working with a lot of conversos from there.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like?
Oh, Rabbi Leon's great. I mean, I met him. I heard we had been on the phone. Someone had told me about him, and he was from Bridgeport, Connecticut, and had taken this pulpit in El Paso when he was a very young man. I think by this time, probably 30 years ago, and he was speaking in Queens about his experience with the conversos. And then I went out there to hear him speak, and he's just a wonderful speaker. He's eloquent and knowledgeable and incredibly warm. So he invited me to come down to El Paso, and it was extraordinary because I met when the beginning of his journey there was that he had been there. I think it was his first week. And he got a phone call from a young man from Juarez, Catholic young man, whose grandmother had just died. And he asked if he could come to see the rabbi. And he told him this story, that the grandmother had just died, and they had been very close. Every Friday night, she would take him to the basement of the home. They would light candles in the basement. She would say prayers in a language that he did not understand. And then they would have a lovely meal. And when she died, he asked his mother if she was going to continue this ritual. And she said no, and he got very upset because it meant something to him. And she said, no, it just doesn't mean anything to me. Why don't you go speak to a priest about it? So we went to the parish priest, and the priest stopped him and he said, I understand what you're saying. I think you should go speak to a rabbi. And there were no rabbis in Juarez. So he went to El Paso and met Rabbi Leon, who said to him, well, you know, I've heard stories of this, but maybe you're what's considered to be maybe your grandmother was a crypto Jew, and maybe you come from, a crypto Judaic background. And he said, Jew? How could my grandmother be a Jew? And then Rabbi Leon explained it to him. Within a week, there were 10 more Mexican Catholic families that had come in with the same story, same type of story. And he said, oh my God, this is real, you know? And now I believe, well, he's an emeritus now, but I believe 10% of the congregation are converted Mexican Catholics.
Wow.
It's amazing. And I remember when I first read about this in the American Southwest, and there was an article on NPR, and they then had gotten written up. And I thought, wow, this is sort of freaky. And then I sort of followed it over the years, and it's become, more and more and more prominent, and more scholarship. And there's been so much more to be revealed. I got to tell you, doing this film was an adventure, and it was an intellectual adventure as well, because to make sense of it was so difficult. I mean, that was the hardest thing. And Jeannie Milgram, at one point I was getting very discouraged, and I thought, this is crazy. This is like, I'm like Don Quixote. This is nuts, and it's just too much. And Jeannie said, this film is so important, she said, because no one has ever tried to make sense of the total diaspora. This is the first time that anyone has ever really done it. I don't know if that's true, but maybe for lay people it is. And it's an exciting thing to do.
You mentioned also that in the film that the Jews not only left Spain for the New World, but many of them went, of course, to Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
The Ottoman Empire was just getting started, and there's a famous story about the Sultan there sending out ships to bring the Jews in who were being expelled from Spain.
Right.
He said, "Oh, well, you can come here. We'd like to have you."
Right. Well, he didn't. The Sultan at the time didn't trust the Catholics from the Byzantine Empire, because he had just conquered them, and he needed functionaries, janissaries. And the Jews were perfect because they were literate, and they wouldn't be loyal. Excuse me. They wouldn't be loyal to the Byzantines. They would be loyal to the Ottomans, who were protecting them, and that's how they say that all happened. And there are so many exciting stories around that.
Right. And from there, of course, we often tell the stories about those mystic Jews in Sfat, in the upper city, the city that's in the upper Galilee in Israel. But they all came from the Ottoman Empire. So they first were expelled from Spain, moved to the Ottoman Empire, and when the Ottoman Empire conquers Palestine, Israel, they moved there, and that's how that whole community got started there. Right. Which is, by the way, why we're doing a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, because it was those mystics in Sfat who started the idea of having a Tikkun Leil Shavuot.
Oh, wow.
And so they were expelled from Spain by this very process.
Yeah. There are a couple of things that I learned that really surprised me. One, that Kol Nidra was a prayer for forgiveness for conversion. And that
I've sometimes seen that way, yes.
Yeah. And that was really stunning to me. And here's this beautiful prayer that makes
the vows that you're trying to get out of are the vows that you made to the Catholic Church.
Right. And that was I had never heard that. I never knew. And then also that Tisha B'Av comes at the same time as it marks the destruction of the temples, but it also it comes at the same time as the expulsion of the Jews from Spain.
Exactly right. The expulsion happened on the same day, the 9th day of Av, as the two temples were destroyed.
Right.
That's an unbelievable divine coincidence, perhaps.
And is it true that the conservative Judaism has accepted Tisha B'Av as a marker of the expulsion officially?
Yes, in fact, it's every year on Tisha B'Av at Beth Yeshurun. Among the other things that we read about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, a paragraph about that.
Yeah, and what a lot of people don't know is that Columbus left Spain at the very same time. And some people
1492.
Yeah, and beginning of August. And some people think that he had put off his voyage. They say he put it off for a bit to wait until Tisha B'Av was over. And he had been funded by conversos, and there's a lot of speculation that he himself came from a converso family. And I sort of I ponder in the film if these families that had been financing him, were they really just looking for the riches of the East? Could they also have been looking for a safe haven?
Safe haven, which of course they did.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned is that the group, of course, landed in Brazil, and then when the Inquisition followed them there, that's the small boat of Jews who went up to what was then New Amsterdam.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, fascinating.
And those were the first Jews in America actually were Sephardic Jews.
Correct. And that what had happened was that the Portuguese had taken over Brazil, and there was a very rich sugar trade, and the Dutch West India Company used to trade with them. And then they got tired of not taking all the money themselves, so they invaded the north of Brazil, and they held it for about 30 years. And so strongly that Dutch Jews came to Brazil, and because so many of them spoke Portuguese, having escaped from Portugal. I mean, it's just such a fascinating, convoluted story. So they were Portuguese Catholics. They came to Amsterdam, and they became Amsterdam Jews, who spoke Portuguese. The Dutch invaded invaded Brazil, and then so these Jews, Portuguese-speaking Jews, became incredibly valuable for this new endeavor, and they built a beautiful synagogue and all this kind of thing.
So that was Shareth Israel in New York.
Well, but this would be, I'm still back in Recife.
Oh,
and
right, yeah.
So then they, but then when the Portuguese came, won it back, they gave them 3 months to get out, and all the Dutch and all the Dutch Jews, and that's when the ship came to, when of course was on its way. I don't know whether it was back to Holland or to one of the Caribbean islands that were Dutch, but wound up in New Amsterdam. It's fascinating. It's just fascinating to think how the world has been changed by this diaspora. It is, and I got to tell you, as doing the film made me think. I mean, it just totally changed my view of history, and it changed my perspective of history and of identity. And all of a sudden, I haven't looked at anybody the same way since I started this film. It's just because we're in so many migrations and so many marriages and intermarriage and et cetera, to suggest that we're just one thing is a little naive.
Right. Wow. So I was gonna mention also that we had at Beth Yeshurun, we had a couple of weeks ago, Josh Furman, who's a local professor at Rice University, did a talk about the first Jews in America, and he did the whole description of the Jews coming to New Amsterdam, and PeterStuyvesant wasn't too happy about it, but the investors in the West Indies Trading Company, some of them happened to be Jewish, so they wrote Stuyvesant that he better admit their landsmen.
Right. My understanding about his anti-Semitism is that he had dealt with Jewish traders in Barbados and had been treated, he felt, very badly. Mm. And that's one of the reasons that he was as anti-Semitic as he was, and didn't trust or want the Jews. But I understand that they were guaranteed by a German or Austrian Jew who had been living in the States. And but they were, that's my understanding, that they were guaranteed. I'm not a historian.
So you also mentioned in the film, I guess, that the Jews not only went to the Ottoman Empire, but some of them also migrated into Ashkenazic countries in Europe.
Well, there are huge migration routes. And, a lot of times you migrate by happenstance, what's available. So people, when they left Spain and Portugal, but Spain in particular, went from Spain to Italy, and because there were city-states that did allow Jews, depending upon the time. But then they went from Italy to Austria, and then from Austria to Poland, and then Poland into East Europe. So I've met people who are, you would think, Ashkenazi Jews who know the shtetl that their family had come from in Poland or Ukraine or wherever, that were all, and that the people, it was peopled with all Sephardic Jews, and even what's his name, the writer who wrote Dr. Zhivago. I'm blanking. Anyway, my understanding is that it's a Russian name, and his family, I can't believe I'm blanking on this, but his family was actually Sephardic.
I have an interesting story. I went to a meeting in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, and it was for the Society of Crypto-Judaic Studies. And I met someone there who had done their DNA. He identified as Ashkenazi. His family was from Hamburg, and originally, and they had gone to live in New York. He was living in Boston. And so he had done his DNA, and he was matched with a lot of people from northern Mexico and South Texas. And it turned out that we met, we didn't know each other. And then it turned out that we were genetically related, which was really mind blowing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, migrations are fascinating things.
Fascinating, yeah.
So I just got a question here. The movie briefly describes how and when Jews originally went to Spain. Do we have any more details about that?
Not more than I covered in the film. The Mediterranean's a big lake,
Right.
And people traded back and forth, back and forth. And so my understanding is that the first reference to Jews in Spain is about 600 BC, and that there are small communities. And I think people have to understand also that Jews were proselytizers at the time. You know, they wanted to spread monotheism, and continued to until it became a capital crime under the Romans and Byzantines. So it's they settled and they set up their trading. Phoenicians did, everybody did, and they skipped along the coast and across the seas, and wound up staying in places.
You also mentioned in the movie that there were Jews who went to Salonika, and then of course there was a thriving community in Salonika until the Holocaust, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rabbi. When I started to do the film, I wasn't interested in doing anything about the Holocaust. I felt that the Holocaust had been covered really well and would continue to be covered really well, but that this Sephardic story, the diaspora, hadn't been covered, and that's what I was planning to do. But then after a point, I had to say to myself, how do you do any Jewish history without including the Holocaust? I mean, you can't just avoid it. But then I was trying to figure out, well, how do I bring the Holocaust into the diaspora? I had never heard about Salonika. I had never heard about Rhodes being, with the people being victims of the Nazis. It was beyond my understanding. And so when I first heard the story of this incredible Jewish community, more than half of Salonika was Jewish, and it was like the jewel in the crown of the Ottoman Empire. There was an extremely wealthy community, and for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so then telling the story of Salonika and how the Nazis had come and taken everyone, like 50,000 people, out of the city and taken them all the way across Europe to Auschwitz to kill them. It's just an extraordinary story.
So you mentioned Rhodes also, and I feel like I have to throw this in. So the famous thing that's known about the ancient world in Rhodes is that there was a large statue called the Colossus, one of the great wonders of the world, whose one leg was on one side of the straits and the other leg was on the other side of the straits, and boats would go under it. And when Emma Lazarus wrote her poem for the Statue of Liberty, she made reference to that Colossus. And in fact, the poem is called The New Colossus, referring to that statue. But she says it's not like that pompous Greek statue over there. This one stands for liberty and freedom. And of course, Emma Lazarus was half Sephardic Jew, half Ashkenazic Jew.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, put it all together. One of the things that struck me in doing this film was how relatively well, the Jews lived in the Muslim world for centuries. And, when we discuss Israel and its problems with its Arab neighbors over the years, so often people say, oh, it's always been this way. The Jews and the Arabs have always been at each other's throats. Well, it's just not true. It's just not true. And that the Jews have been dealt with very often, not all the time, but very often, very fairly, and prospered in the Ottoman Empire, really prospered. And I think it's important to understand this and to remember this and to hope that that this coexistence, this convivencia can happen again.
Right. So, and of course, the Jews and Christians and Muslims had a way of getting along with each other, the convivencia, as it's called, during the Golden Age of Spain, which was, the earliest from the 6th or 7th century until around the 12th century. And that was when Spain was at the height of science, medicine, art, philosophy, literature, poetry. It was a brilliant, thriving culture, while the rest of Europe was in the Dark Ages.
Yeah. And it was a blending of cultures and sharing, and so one culture's work would excite another artist or another intellectual or another scientist.
Right.
And, and that's the great thing about diversity. And, this is what we have in the United States.
Right. Well, it's been a great evening. I think speaking with both of you, Joe and Doreen, and I really want to thank you both for taking the time to spend with us. You're welcome to stay for the next part of our program, which will be in about 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
And at that point, Anna is going to do a PowerPoint presentation specifically about the Converso crypto Jews in the Mexico, Texas area, which she's done a lot of research on. She has a PowerPoint presentation that she's going to do about that, and it'll kind of bring it home for us here in Texas about how it's really right in our backyard here.
Right.
So you're welcome to stay if you would like to.
I would. It's not so late as it is for Doreen. And
Yeah.
would you be kind enough to let people know what our website is?
Oh yeah, sure. Just tell them what your website is. Yeah.
Our website. Our website is www.childrenoftheinquisition.com. And there's a lot more information on that. And we're going to beef it up so there'll be even more information on it. And in the future, people, not too distant future, people will be able to download the film there as well.
Okay.
But this is our online premiere. And I want to thank you and your congregation for having invited us and having supported us. And it's so meaningful to me and to everyone who's worked on the film. And I very much appreciate it. And I hope people have enjoyed it.
Great.
We'd be very eager to hear their comments.
Okay, super. Well, we'll definitely pass all the comments we get on to you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for joining us. And now we're going to take a few minute break here. And don't adjust your computers or laptops or phones or tablets or Ouija boards. And
we don't have to go back to your website, or we're already on your website.
You can stay on this way or go to our website, either way, because you'll be able to see Anna's presentation here.
Great.
And we'll be back in about 5 minutes, so don't go away, don't refresh your screen, just take a break, stretch, have some ice cream or something, enjoy Shavuot, and we'll be back at 9:30 for Anna's presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, Doreen.
Bye, Doreen.
Okay.
Can I put the PowerPoint on?
Sure, you can set it up.
I'm gonna do that now.
Do you want to block my turn my audio off, or should I?
Yeah, that'd be great, Joe.
Yeah. Let's see.
Okay, I guess we're back. It's 9:30. Yeah, so Anna's now going to do her presentation. Take it away, Anna.
All right, thank you, Rabbi. So my name is Anna Guerra. I'm a psychotherapist in private practice here in Houston. And I've lived in Houston for 28 years, since 1992. But I'm originally from a small town in South Texas called Laredo. I'm actually a 9th generation Laredoan. And like many, many, many people in that town, my family history goes back to 1755 when the town was founded. And the founding families along the river, there's several communities that were established in the 1750s. And those founding families come from an area in northern Mexico that was called Nuevo León. And what you see here is really what remains of a very large province. But the founding families of Laredo come from Nuevo León, and like many others in the area, I can also trace my origins to the original settlers of Monterrey, which is one of the major cities in Nuevo León, and the surrounding area. And what I'm going to highlight is the Sephardic history of the people of this region. And just by way of framing the history, I want to mention a couple of things that have happened in recent history. One of them is that in 2015, Spain offered citizenship to the descendants of the Jews who had been expelled in 1492, whether they were still currently identified as Jewish or not. A recent story in Monterrey put the number of applicants from Nuevo León at 20,000. Also, there's been an announcement. There will be an opening of a museum for Sephardic history of Nuevo León in Monterrey, and that should be happening in the next couple of years. I also want to mention a story coming out of the 1940s. There was a researcher from Israel. She did her dissertation on what remained of Jewish identity and customs in the Monterrey region. And while she was there, she interviewed Rabbi Kaiman, who was the rabbi who had arrived at Monterrey in the 1940s. And he said that when he arrived, thousands and thousands of people from the Catholic community had come to him with tales and documents explaining to him that they were Jews, and many of them wished to return to their roots. At the time, his stock answer was that he did not perform conversions. The story of the region is very tied to what happened after the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, and specifically what happened in Portugal. So we had a lot of Jewish refugees in 1492 fleeing to Portugal, and the Jewish community there swelled. But we know that the reprieve for these refugees was short-lived. In 1496, the king of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of the Catholic monarchs, and as a precondition, they asked him to issue his own edict of expulsion. And then the following year, he actually changed that edict to one of forced conversion. So you had many, many Jews who were forcibly converted. And these are the Portuguese who at some point end up in the New World. There was a point in our history where Judaizer and Portuguese or Jewish were perfectly synonymous. And this is the context for the family Carvajal, which will be very important in the settlement of Nuevo León. This is a family that emerges out of the to and fro movement along the Spanish and Portuguese border. And the first Carvajal I want to mention, because there's I'm going to mention several in his family. But the first one is Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva. He was born actually in Mogaduro, which is on the Spanish-Portuguese border, but on the Portuguese side. And then later he went and lived on the Spanish side when he was about 8 years old. But he becomes very important in the history of northern Mexico because in 1579, King Philip II gave him a very large land grant that was over 700,000 square kilometers large. It encompassed about a third of present-day Mexico. And as you can see, it also includes the area that's now Laredo and even San Antonio. As part of these land grants, whenever the king gave a land grant, he also issued accompanied orders. And these were to facilitate the establishment of the colony. And one of the orders that's often mentioned in conjunction with this land grant is that he issued an order to the authorities in the city of Seville. And the order was that they were not to look into the background of Carvajal's colonists. Because normally you had to get an inspection and you had to get a limpieza de sangre to come to the New World. But they were ordered to not look into his colonists. And instead, he was supposed to actually do that. But what we know is that Carvajal brought over 36 of his own, it's estimated about 36 of his own converso family members, as well as an additional 39 converso passengers.
You should probably tell people what limpia de sangre is.
Limpieza de sangre is, there was a time after the expulsion and during actually many centuries in Spain and New Spain, where certain things were forbidden to people of Jewish background. And you often had your background researched to get a pass or authorization for whatever purpose you were being looked into. So in this case, the background, it was a background check on the colonists that needed to be done here, and it was Carvajal who was charged with doing this. But you know what we do know is that he actually did bring converso passengers with him, so he didn't follow that order, and he brought in 36 of his converso family members and other passengers as well. And we also know that in the colony already, in the area, we had other Portuguese Jewish people. And there's been an estimate that out of the original founders, about 68% were of Portuguese Jewish background. We also know that the people in the area practice endogamy. You'll hear that a lot. When you do your own family history genealogies, and anyone in the region who does it sees the same families interweaving over and over and over again, same last names. And it's not unusual in Laredo, where I'm from, to be actually related and cousins with people, in varying distances. But going back to the Carvajal story, there are two Carvajals that often get confused, and I want to just differentiate them. One of them I'll call the governor, and he was the first governor of this large province. And the other one was his nephew, who is Luis de Carvajal the Younger. The governor's sister, her husband, and all of her children came with him to the New World to establish this colony, and the younger Luis was with him. And they're both going to be very, very well known in our history. We know that the governor was a converso, his family was a converso. We see them in the records of the Inquisition in Portugal. We don't know if he was a crypto Jew. In other words, we don't know if he was a sincere Catholic or if he was still practicing his Judaism. But we do know that his wife was a crypto Jew. He married a woman from Seville. Her name was Guiomar. And Guiomar set in motion something that may have led to the downfall of the Carvajal family. The family, before they departed Seville, stayed with Guiomar, and she extracted a promise from Isabel, the governor's niece, that when they reached the New World, that she would try to convert the governor. And she did this. When they reached the New World, she tried to do this, and she also tried to do this with the governor's administrative assistant. And he was the one who at some point made a report to the Inquisition authorities about the family's activities in the New World. So this is a statue of Governor Carvajal. It overlooks the city of Monterrey. And at some point, Governor Carvajal was involved in a lot of lawsuits with people who were other land grantees in the area over unclear boundaries. And they were consistently decided in his favor. And his enemies decided to change tactics, and they charged Carvajal with leading slaving raids and enslaving Indians. And at one point, so he's arrested and he's placed in a civil jail. And then his assistant appears at the office of the Inquisition and makes his report. And so the governor is transferred to the Inquisition jail, and his family's picked up. They're arrested. The governor actually was charged and convicted of concealing his family's Judaizing, and he ended up dying in prison, awaiting exile to Spain. An interesting part of the story is the flight of a group of people from Monterrey into New Mexico. Carvajal had a lieutenant governor named Gaspar Castaño de Sosa. He was related to the governor's in-laws. During the interrogations of Luis de Carvajal, the younger, he was identified, or his family was identified as Judaizers. And so after the governor is arrested, he and about 160 or 170 people take flight into New Mexico. And one scholar had this to say about it was an illegal departure. They didn't have permission to go. He said that the sudden and illegal departure of Castaño's expedition, the coincidence of timing with the conviction of Governor Carvajal, Castaño's own ethnic background and familial ties to known Judaizers, and the absence of a priest or member of a religious order from his company, the only expedition into the northern frontier of its day to fail to include such representatives, all strongly suggest that the lieutenant governor initiated the dangerous entry into New Mexico, at least partially for the purpose of leading other crypto-Jews to a secure haven on the far northern frontier. Interesting about the timing, for those of you interested in this history, his entry into New Mexico predates the entry of Onates by 8 years. Also, people in my area are often, like myself, we find who's believed to be his brother, Baltasar, on our lineage. He's actually a common ancestor of many of ours in the area. So back to the story of the Carvajals. So after the governor's assistant appears at the office of the Inquisition, the Carvajal family was arrested, and they are placed in the Inquisition jail. They're tortured. And the image I'm showing you here is called The Torture of Isabel de Carvajal. And what's important is that these images are part of a book called El Libro Rojo, which is a book containing the significant events of Mexican history. So the story of the Carvajals is very big in the Mexican psyche. So, so the family's arrested, some of them are tortured. Luis de Carvajal, the younger, is one of the people that's arrested. He he's placed very near the torture chamber. He can hear his brother and sisters being tortured. And one of the interesting things about his experience is his dream life. While he was in prison, he started dreaming that he has a dream, for example, that he says, the holy prophets are praying for you. He hears a voice saying that. On another night, he dreams that Solomon appears to him and gives him a liquid that is full of divine wisdom. And all of this gives him solace during a very difficult time. And it was during this time that he decides he's going to be someone who will give guidance to his people. He changes his name. He changes his name to Joseph, the light bearer, Joseph Lumbroso. And he's very, very, very committed to his Judaism, so committed that when he was in prison, there was a prisoner that was a monk who shared his cell, and Luis actually converted him during that time. So, so Luis decides he's going to get out of prison, and because this is his first offense, he's able to admit to what he's done and be penanced. So this is the way the Inquisition functioned. The first time you were caught in a heresy, you could be penanced without the loss of your life. You had to swear to be reconciled to the Catholic faith and would henceforth live true Christian lives. So Luis and his family did this. They were part of a very large auto de fe, the auto de fe of 1590 in Mexico. This one would have involved them in the large parade that went through the city. The family's punishment would have included the confiscation of their property, as well as the wearing of a San Benito. A San Benito is a cloak that you wear that tells people what your crime is and what your punishment is. This is an example of a San Benito. So the family not only wore it on the day of their auto de fe, they also wore it during their years of penance and punishment. Luis and his mothers and his sisters were sentenced to wear these and to serve in various institutions. Oops, what did I do here? And at one point, Luis is assigned to work at a college. He's assigned to work for a friar at the College de Santa Cruz, where he gains access to a library and biblical texts. And it was there that he has access to books that were forbidden to lay people. He continued to Judaize, and he starts writing religious tracts and a diary. He writes a diary in the third person as Joseph Lumbroso. He writes it in very tiny script, and he carries it on his body. This is the diary that was lost or stolen from the Mexican archives, but resurfaced a few years ago. And it had been missing for 80 years. And a collector of Judaica in New York recognized it at an auction and alerted the authorities. And then it was put on display at the New York Historical Society's museum in an exhibit on early American Jewish history. It was actually its prized artifact. It's really small. You can see me standing next to it here, and you could also see it compared to a cell phone. An interesting aside on the story is after the Carvajals were picked up, one of their in-laws directed his wife to make sure that that his meals were prepared with ham or bacon. So the family continues to practice Judaism even after they're released. And because they continue their Judaizing, the family is denounced again. Luis had become a leader and a teacher among the Judaizers. And at one point he attends a gathering of crypto Jews, and someone there tries to convert someone, and that person recognizes Luis and alerts the authorities. And under interrogation, his sister, sort of spills the beans on the family. So while Luis is imprisoned, he starts to write notes to his mother. And at first, he writes notes to his mother and his sisters on avocado seeds. But then he's given paper and pen, and he ends up writing about 20 letters to his mother and sisters that we still have that we have access to. And he also starts to write a spiritual will. This is an example of something in his spiritual will. Because this was the family's second time of second arrest, their execution was certain. And the only choices they had now would be how they would be executed. People were given the choice of, if they repented and returned to the Catholic faith, they would be garroted instead of burned. So
Because garroting is so much better, huh?
Because garroted is so much more, yeah, so much better. Yeah, that was the whole idea. You were be spared the burning. This is another image from the Red Book. This is Mariana de Carvajal. So the auto de fe in which the family was killed was a very elaborate auto de fe with a carnival-like atmosphere. And it was designed to really just terrorize the populace. So, sometimes they'll point to how many people died in Mexico and during the Inquisition, but I think that fails to really, translate the terror in the populace of seeing these spectacles. So anyway, many of the family died, but they didn't all die at the same time, which was kind of interesting. His brother, Gaspar, Luis's brother, was actually a priest, and he didn't die, he was reconciled. And then he had two sisters who were part of subsequent auto de fes, and interesting, one of his sisters didn't die for another 50 years in an Inquisition auto de fe. So this is the Palace of the Inquisition in Mexico City. And I put a remark here by the head of, who used to be the head of Jewish Studies at the University of Houston, Maria Teresa Hernandez, who makes a comment about the Carvajal story being a foundational narrative for Mexico. And that it's a story that repeats itself. And she also points out that Luis de Carvajal the Younger is that he left letters and this memoir, and it's the only known writing of anyone willing to admit to being Jewish during Mexico's colonial period outside of the Inquisition. So it's a very, very important memoir and writing. The importance of the Carvajal story is to Mexico. I think is also you could also see it in that it was part of this what do you call it, this painting, this painting by Diego Rivera. This was actually painted on the very square where people were executed. And it's called Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park. And in the corner here, you'll see one of the Carvajals, and standing next to the Carvajals is the first bishop and founder of the Inquisition in Mexico. I want to mention two other of my ancestors in Monterrey, who is also the ancestor of many people in the area and in Laredo, where I come from. His name is Francisco Baez de Benavides. And there's interesting stories about him around two criminal trials that he was involved with. And one of them involved this conflict that he got into with the dean of the cathedral. And they had this conflict out on the street, and Baez de Benavides pulled a gun on him, and he was brought to trial. It resulted in a verdict that included a fine, 2 years banishment, and the confiscation of his guns. But what's very interesting is that there was an appeal of this sentence, and the governor of the area suspended the sentence and said that he was suspending it on account of this being a land of war. And it suits the service of our majesty and the defense of this reign. And I highlight this story because, you know, this was the frontier. This was very far away from Mexico City. Able-bodied men with arms were needed. And this is often cited as the reason why there was more tolerance for conversos in this region. The other story the other criminal trial that Baez de Benavides was involved in is interesting because of the witnesses that showed up against them, and the testimony against him was that he was, you know, quote unquote Portuguese. And basically, the idea here is that the witnesses were testifying that he was Jewish, and that had something to do with his character. I'll mention another ancestor. This one is Marcos Alonso de la Garza Falcon. And mainly I'm mentioning him because of the de la Garza last name. Most people in our area have met de la Garza or Garza. People have dropped the de la part. And he's the progenitor of this surname in South Texas and northern Mexico. I understand that this is really not a surname that's well known in Spain. So if you meet someone with this last name, they're going to be descended from Marcos Alonso. We know that he was from, again, the border area here of between Spain and Portugal. And at some point, there's a connection made between this colonist in northern Spain, northern Mexico, and a couple of people that died in Alto de Fe in the Canary Islands, who were also from his hometown in Lepe. So I'll say something about this region called Nuevo Santander. At some point, there was a new region that was established that kind of that cut the Nuevo León area, made it a little bit smaller. But in this new region, in the 1750s, about 24 settlements were established along the river. One of the settlements was the only two settlements on the northern side of the river was Laredo and an area called Dolores. And the settlers that settled this area were people who are descendant from those original colonists in the Nuevo León area. And the reason that they were trying to settle this area was to deal with the hostile Indians in the area. So there's the connection there between the original settlers of Monterrey and their descendants along the Rio Grande. One of those descendants is Tomás Sanchez. He's the founder of Laredo. He's my 9th great grandfather. Just for anyone in the area that descends from him and wants to connect to this history, he himself, his mother was a de la Garza. His his great grandfather was Marcos Alonso de la Garza. Another one of his ancestors is another Portuguese named Alberto do Canto, and Portuguese from the Azores. My great-great-grandmother from Monterrey is also a de la Garza through her mother, and this is how I came to this is how I came to learn about our Sephardic history from Monterrey. I've told this story before, but at one point I had an Ashkenazi Jewish friend of mine say to me, kind of out of the blue, she said, you know, Anna, you're Jewish, and then she explained to me what a Sephardic Jew was, and this was really something I'd never heard of. I didn't even know what Sephardic meant. But I called my father, and I was at the University of Texas at the time. So I called my dad, and he said to me, he said, well, my great-grandmother was Jewish, and she came from Monterrey. And that was kind of it for a long time. And you know, that's just something, it was just a small piece of history that I had learned. But over time, I got very curious about this great-great-grandmother. And I wondered how a Hispanic person could be Jewish, how they could be Jewish in Catholic Spain. And so I started digging and came to understand this history through that opening. So she was from Monterrey, and she came to live in Laredo in the 1880s. And what's interesting is that, you know, this was over 100 years ago. And when she came to Laredo, my great-great-grandmother openly called herself Jewish. And she, I've been told the story that she had a study group that studied Judaism. And interestingly, at the time, Laredo was starting to have people coming in that were Germanic Reform Jews. The Alexanders that's one family that came from Germany and whose name is recognized in Laredo. And it's really interesting because their shops would have been just right around the corner from each other. About a couple of months ago, I wrote an article for the local newspaper in Laredo, and I wrote about my great-great-grandmother, and a distant cousin wrote to me, and then we talked on the phone, and she told me about her grandmother, who was related to you know, my ancestress, and how the family always remarked about her quirks. That she had these behaviors that they just couldn't make sense of. And after having read my article, they started to make sense. And some of the things she did, of course, were she lit candles on Friday at sundown. It was a time that was considered very solemn. Radios could not be played at that time. She would also not allow the cutting of nails on the weekends, beginning on Friday. And also, one could not eat pork after sunset, which is kind of interesting. It wasn't that you could not ever eat pork, it was just after sunset you couldn't eat pork. In the region, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, oftentimes when people with my heritage do our DNA, have our DNA done, it often comes back with connections to people that I'm assuming are Ashkenazi Jews or people from certain areas in, you can see certain areas that are listed like Russia and people, Lithuania, and it's unusual for, you know, so it's really very striking when we end up doing our DNA and have these matches. And there's a lot of people. I just took a couple of screenshots. And I think I already mentioned earlier a distant cousin that I met in Philadelphia at this conference. I do want to mention a piece of research that was done a while back by, I'm going to go back, I said something about this research that was done by an Israeli. Her name is Shulamit Halevi. She spent 15 years in the northern Mexico area around Monterrey. She really wanted to know, she had heard stories of the area and wanted to know, well, what remained of the identity and what remained of the Jewish practices, and how were they transmitted. So in that time, she discovered that several things, actually, several Jewish customs did remain, and she separated them. In these three different categories. And she notes that people in the area might avoid pork. They drain blood from their animals and their farms, circumcision, fasting for Yom Kippur, separating meat and dairy. This is one that I'd actually heard in my family: refraining from conjugal relations for 40 days after birth. And then this last category is very interesting, because it's this last category, she says, it's not something you could actually learn from Western Jews. Orienting beds north and south, sweeping towards the center of the room, burning or burying nail clippings. And again, some of these are things that I have actually heard of in the family. I want to say something about this center in Monterrey. This is the woman who is really spearheading a lot of the research in Monterrey. And in a conversation I had with her recently, she's told me about some mikvahs in a ranch that she's trying to preserve, which is kind of interesting. And of course, she's the one who is behind the museum that's been announced in Monterrey. I think that's where I'm going to end, and I might take any questions if anybody has them.
So one question was, sorry, start my video. How has this research kind of affected you personally? How has it benefited you? Maybe what has it led you to think about, I guess, in terms of your ancestors, your identity, whatever?
Gosh, I think I could write a dissertation at this point. So, you know, I'm known at Beth Yeshurun. I converted 2 years ago. So, you know, for me, the change has been pretty profound. I've learned a lot about the importance of history and how I've had a chance to really think about how important it is to really know your history, and the effects of not knowing that. Actually, it could affect all sorts of things. Yeah.
And we didn't get to ask Doreen this, but we did ask Doreen earlier because her last name is also Carvajal. And so the obvious question is she related possibly to this major Carvajal family down here? And she said she was not able to establish that connection, but it seems to me likely that there's some relationship back in history somewhere.
Somewhere in history, yeah. You know, also interestingly though, the family of the Carvajal sister, the governor's sister, her name was, she married a Rodriguez Matos. So all of her children were actually Rodriguezes. And if you look along the tree, many people have different surnames. And that's something you see a lot in the descendants of the crypto Jews. In northern Mexico, for example, the descendants of Garza, Marcos Alonso de la Garza, they half of them ended up with the Garza surname and half of them ended up Treviños. And so they were all related, but you know, I'm not sure why they didn't just have one, you know, all have the father's last name. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been quite a story. One of the reasons that we wanted to bring this program tonight is partly because Shavuot, and it's about the giving of the Ten Commandments and accepting sort of the Jewish way of life. both for the Israelites who were standing at Mount Sinai originally, and then the book of Ruth that we read on Shavuot. Ruth, of course, is considered the Bible's model Jew by choice. She's not born Jewish, but she accepts Judaism and commits herself to joining the Jewish people. And so here's the story about conversos who were forced to leave, but still tried to maintain this connection to Judaism. And many of them now are returning to Judaism and going through a formal conversion process, learning how to integrate it back into the Jewish world. And Rabbi Leon in El Paso and here in Houston, we have a number of people who sort of have this ancestry who are now discovering it and learning about it. One of the things
I want to say how valuable the conversion program is at Beth Yeshurun. It's invaluable. Every year there's a new class. Is that right, Rabbi?
Yeah.
And people can take the introduction to Judaism. So even if you don't end up converting, you can take the class and learn all about learn all about Judaism. And accompanying that classes are classes in Hebrew. And if you take that class, you'll come out of there with a good head start in Hebrew. It's a wonderful program. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Yeah, well, so and that relates to another question here. Somebody asked if a person discovers he or she is Jewish, is conversion a must? Certainly not. It's not a requirement to convert. It's just an opportunity to think about it. Would it be different if you went to a Sephardic or an Ashkenazic synagogue? Yeah, so oddly enough, many Sephardic congregations are more reluctant to accept converts than Ashkenazic. At least this is what anecdotally I've heard. And I think that may be because the Sephardic congregations are still maybe traumatized by the whole Inquisition thing, and they're afraid of outsiders coming in and then changing their mind and turning against them or something, perhaps. I don't know. And also, I mean, it depends on what denomination of Judaism and so on. Certainly, one of the things that I think is really important for people who are born Jewish to know is that, and I think at Beth Yeshurun we try to do in our congregation is to welcome people who have chosen to become Jewish. It's a real blessing to us to have people who are committed, who don't have to be Jewish. They weren't born Jewish, but they've sought out a faith and they found Judaism and they find it meaningful to them. And we should be welcoming them, whether they were of converso ancestry or whatever, and certainly help to make them feel part of our community. So I got another question here. Are all Tejanos or Garzas of Jewish heritage? Do we know, or a significant percentage perhaps?
I don't know what the percentage is, but if you're a Trevino or a Garza, I've got a dissertation for you that you might be interested in. And the ones in the Monterrey region still retain that knowledge. And so maybe it has to do with how far you are from that epicenter. But certainly if you go back to those early colonists, you are going to be significantly of Portuguese Jewish descent.
There's a dissertation somebody wrote about this?
The dissertation I mentioned in my talk, Halevi.
Oh, right.
Yes, she actually spends a lot of time with the Garzas and the Treviños, so different members of that clan. Yes.
So if people are interested, they should let us know and we'll forward it to you?
Yes, absolutely. And I will make that dissertation available. It's actually available online. So if you look for it, but I can certainly point people in that direction.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of research in genealogy. There's a couple of websites. There's a website called We Are Cousins. There's a website called Somos Primos, because literally in South Texas, we are cousins.
So this is specifically for converso genealogy.
This is specific for the genealogy of Northern Mexico and South Texas.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, and we have a lot of information, and there's even information as to the Y-DNA of our ancestors. So it's really very in depth.
So I should mention here, I think that Bennett Greenspan, Bennett and Robin Greenspan, who are, sponsoring this event. Bennett, of course, does genetic testing and genealogical testing. So if you're interested, we have our own member who does that. And in July, we're going to have the Greater Houston Jewish Genealogical Society offer two Sunday programs where they'll be helping people discover their own genealogy. So stay tuned to our emails and website if you are interested in learning about your own genealogy. There is a Greater Houston Jewish Genealogical Society that specializes in helping us to find out about that. So, and it does add a lot to your story. It tells the story of your family.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Whoops. Do we have another question here? Does Benavides mean Ben Ovadia in Hebrew? Benavides. I think it means good life, doesn't it? Well,
good. I think it does mean good life. Ben Avides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ovadia in Hebrew would mean servant of God.
Okay.
Yeah. Kind of in Islam they would be Abdullah, right? Abdullah is the equivalent of Ovadia in Hebrew. Okay, well, I think those are pretty much the questions. I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Anna, for your presentation. And thank everybody for coming and being part of this program. Tomorrow morning, we're all going to be standing again at Mount Sinai for the first time again. And if you would like to join Beth Yeshurun, we're going to have our services live streamed at 9:30. Well, we'll be reading the Ten Commandments. We all should stand and accept the Ten Commandments again, even if we're standing in our own separate homes watching the live streaming. We can stand and accept the Ten Commandments. And then tomorrow night at 6 o'clock is a Shabbat evening service for the second night of Shavuot. And Saturday will be Shabbat, Shavuot, and Yizkor services at 9:30. So I think I've covered pretty much everybody. Oh, yes, and the Children of the Inquisition, the movie, will still be available for watching after this program. If you didn't get to see it and you got interested because of the conversation, it's still available. You can go to our website and get the URL to watch the movie, the code, the website code, and the access code is by signing up. Just register for the program, and you'll get an email with that information. And it'll be available with that code until 8 o'clock Central Time on Sunday. So if you don't want to use the computer for that on the festival or Shabbat, you can still have Saturday night and Sunday to watch it. It is a really fascinating movie, a very thought-provoking movie about the story of Jewish history that really is powerful and important and really affected the course of a lot of history around the world. So thank you all for joining us for this program tonight, and I hope you all have ice cream or cheesecake or something, because we're supposed to eat dairy tonight, and we should have something sweet also as we get prepared to receive the Torah again. So thank you for joining us here at Beth Yeshurun, and we'll look forward to seeing you in future events.
Thank you, Rabbi.